An unnerving royal duty. Picture a queen, hours after giving birth, still bleeding, exhausted, watching her newborn ripped from her arms and handed to a stranger. A wet nurse who'll feed that baby while the queen's expected to get pregnant again immediately. This wasn't some medieval horror that died out centuries ago. Queen Elizabeth II's own mother couldn't breastfeed her daughters in the 1930s. Marie Antoinette shocked French society by insisting on nursing one child. Courtiers whispered she was behaving like a peasant. Tonight you'll learn why royal women were treated as breeding machines, denied the most basic maternal bond. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm glad you're here. Get comfortable. Pull those covers up. Dim the lights. If this helps you sleep better, hit subscribe. It really helps us keep these stories coming. And drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I love seeing our little global community settling in together. Tonight's story is heavy, but important. We're diving into centuries of royal women who had their babies taken away moments after birth. It's heartbreaking, but you'll understand why it happened and why it finally stopped. England, 1327. The Queen's chamber reeks of blood and sweat. She's just delivered her third child, a son this time. Thank God, a son. But before she can even hold him properly, the wet nurse steps forward. The court physician nods. Your Majesty must not nurse. You need to conceive again quickly. The baby's cries fade as he's carried to the nursery wing. The Queen reaches out, then drops her hand. This is duty. This is what royal mothers do. They birth heirs, then step aside while other women raise them. This wasn't just English practice. Across Europe, royal mothers faced the same reality. The moment that baby crowned, the countdown started. How quickly could they get pregnant again? Medical theory said breastfeeding prevented conception, and they weren't entirely wrong. Lactation does suppress fertility in many women, but court physicians treated this like an absolute law. A nursing queen was a useless queen. Her body belonged to the state, not to her children. The heir needed backup heirs. Infant mortality was brutal. One son wasn't enough. Finding the right wet nurse was serious business. Court physicians interviewed candidates like they were hiring for the most important job in the kingdom. Because they were. The woman had to be the right age, right health, right moral character. Her own baby, that was sacrificed. Weaned immediately so she could feed royal blood instead. Some wet nurses' children died after being suddenly cut off from their mother's milk. The royal infant's needs came first, always. Human cost didn't matter when heirs were at stake. The selection process was invasive and weird. Physicians examined the wet nurse's breasts, tested her milk by tasting it. Yes, actually tasting it. They checked her blood, her urine, her overall constitution. Her own child had to be the same sex as the royal baby. Different milk for boys and girls, they believed. If everything checked out, she'd be installed in the royal nursery. Separate quarters, her own servants, complete control over the infant. The biological mother. She got visiting hours. Marie Antoinette's letters reveal the heartbreak. They took my daughter before I'd even recovered from birth. I begged to nurse her myself. But the king's physicians forbade it absolutely. They said it would prevent me from conceiving the son France needs. She saw her baby 1 hour each afternoon. When she finally defied convention and nursed a later child, Versailles went crazy. Courtiers whispered she was acting like a peasant. Breastfeeding was beneath a queen's dignity. It was messy, animalistic, common. But here's what gets me about this. Many royal children grew up calling their wet nurses mother, and their actual mothers by formal titles. Louis XIII of France stayed close to his wet nurse his entire life, visiting her, supporting her financially. Some wet nurses had more influence over future kings than the queens who birthed them. The emotional damage was massive. Royal families became these cold, formal arrangements. Children who barely knew their parents, mothers who were strangers to their own kids. The practice started cracking in the late 1700s. Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau said mothers nursing their own babies was natural, beneficial, revolutionary thinking, but royal resistance was strong. Queen Victoria found breastfeeding disgusting, called it making a cow of oneself, used wet nurses for all 9 children. Her daughter wanted to nurse her kids, but faced massive opposition from German court physicians. Medically dangerous, they said, socially inappropriate. The objectification ran deep. Queens' bodies weren't their own. Real change didn't come until the mid-1900s. Queen Elizabeth II quietly nursed some of her children. Princess Diana openly breastfed William and Harry in the 1980s, helping normalise it for upper classes. Now Catherine, Princess of Wales, breastfeeds without controversy. But think about that timeline. It took until the late 20th century for royal mothers to reclaim this basic biological function. Centuries of separation, of babies handed to strangers, of mothers treated like breeding stock. The emotional scars lasted generations. As you drift off tonight, imagine that grief, holding your newborn for moments before they're taken away, watching a stranger become their source of comfort while you're prepared for the next pregnancy. Your body controlled by physicians and politicians who see you as valuable only for your womb. Some resisted when they could. Most lived with formal relationships with children they barely knew. Rest knowing your body is your own, your bond with your children sacred and protected. Freedom's royal mothers couldn't imagine until shockingly recently. Bitter birthright, nursing in ancient cities. Picture Babylon, around 1750 BCE. King Hammurabi's scribes are chiseling laws into stone tablets, and buried in all those rules about property and punishment, there it is. Wet nursing contracts, legal obligations, payment schedules. This wasn't some casual arrangement between neighbours. Ancient civilizations had turned the feeding of babies into a formal institution. Women's bodies, their milk, their maternal bonds, all of it regulated, commodified, systematized. And this is just the beginning of a story that reaches right into modern royal nurseries. The Babylonian law codes are fascinating because they're so specific. Contract 194 lays out exactly what happens when a wet nurse takes payment but then refuses to nurse the child. She has to pay back double. Contract 195 covers what happens if the wet nurse's own baby dies while she's feeding someone else's child. And honestly, the coldness of it is striking. These weren't just legal technicalities. Real women, real babies, real grief, all reduced to contractual obligations. But here's what gets me about these ancient laws. They assumed wet nursing would create problems. The laws wouldn't exist if disputes weren't happening constantly. Women taking money and disappearing, babies dying under suspicious circumstances, wet nurses demanding more payment halfway through, families fighting over which woman had rights to which child. Ancient Babylon was dealing with the same messy human realities that would plague wet nursing for the next 4,000 years. The laws were trying to impose order on something inherently chaotic, the buying and selling of maternal care. Move forward about 1,000 years to ancient Egypt. The tomb paintings are incredible. Wealthy Egyptian women reclining while other women nurse their babies. Hieroglyphs describing the wet nurse's duties, her social status, even her diet, because what she ate supposedly affected the milk quality. Egyptian medical papyri detail the ideal wet nurse. Young, healthy, recent mother herself, preferably with a son, if she's nursing a boy. The Egyptians believed the wet nurse's character would transfer through her milk into the child's personality. But here's what's haunting about those Egyptian tomb paintings. The biological mothers, they're just sitting there, watching, not holding their own babies, not involved in the feeding. They're like spectators to their own children's care. Art historians think this was aspirational, showing how wealthy you were, how removed from physical labour. But imagine being that mother, watching another woman nourish your child while you sit idle. The emotional cost had to be enormous, even if society told you this was proper and desirable. The ancient world established something crucial: wet nursing as a status symbol. Only poor women nursed their own babies because they had no choice. Wealthy women demonstrated their social position by delegating that work to servants. This pattern spread throughout the Mediterranean. Greek philosophers wrote about it. Roman senators' wives practiced it. By the time we reach medieval Europe, wet nursing for the upper classes wasn't just common, it was expected, required. A mark of civilization itself. And that's when things got really systematized. Medieval European nobility turned wet nursing into an art form. Detailed contracts, background checks on potential wet nurses, medical examinations, salary negotiations, housing arrangements. The wet nurse for a duke's heir might earn more than most craftsmen. She'd have her own servants, her own quarters in the castle, official court status. But think about the flip side. Her own baby got handed off to some lower status woman, creating this brutal chain where the poorest mothers nursed their own children while everyone else climbed the social ladder. The contrast is stark when you look at ordinary women versus royal mothers. A peasant woman gives birth, puts the baby to her breast, keeps working the fields or tending the household. Natural, immediate, practical. A noble woman gives birth, and within hours, sometimes minutes, the baby is whisked away to the wet nurse's chambers. The mother might see her child for brief, supervised visits. Two completely different experiences of motherhood, determined entirely by social class. The wealthy bought their way out of biological bonds. What really drove this system was medical theory. Enter Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose ideas dominated European medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen taught that breast milk was transformed blood, that nursing drained women's vital energy. Most importantly, that breastfeeding prevented pregnancy because lactation suppressed fertility. For noble families desperate to produce multiple heirs, this was terrifying. A woman who nursed her own baby might not conceive again for years. Unacceptable, dangerous, the wet nurse became a fertility strategy. Galenic theory created this twisted logic. Breastfeeding was simultaneously seen as vital for babies, but too draining for upper-class women. The solution: hire a lower-class woman, whose energy and fertility didn't matter to absorb those costs. She could sacrifice her health, her future pregnancies, her bond with her own child, to preserve the noble lady's reproductive capacity. Medieval medical texts are full of warnings about the dangers of noble women nursing, while completely ignoring the identical dangers faced by their wet nurses. By the late medieval period, this system was so entrenched that questioning it seemed absurd. Medical authorities, church leaders, social customs, all aligned to separate upper-class mothers from their nursing babies. The stage was set for what would become the ultimate expression of this practice: royal wet nursing, where queens would be literally forbidden from feeding their own children. And the justifications for that level of control, they get even more disturbing. Medical theories that treated women's bodies like state property, designed for one purpose: producing the next generation of rulers. Galenic theory, a disastrous legacy. Here's where things get really dark. Everything you just heard about royal mothers being ripped away from their newborns, it wasn't just cruel tradition, it was backed by what everyone believed was legitimate medical science. For over 1,000 years, European medicine was dominated by the theories of one man, Galen of Pergamon, ancient Greek physician, brilliant surgeon, prolific writer, and completely catastrophically wrong about women's bodies. His ideas about breastfeeding would doom generations of mothers and babies. Galen believed breast milk was literally blood, not similar to blood, not made from blood. He thought it was blood, just transformed. Picture this: he's dissecting bodies in Roman amphitheatres around 150 AD, trying to understand how lactation works. He notices blood vessels leading to the breasts, sees the pale colour of milk, and decides milk must be whitened blood. The same blood that flows through your veins, just magically changed colour when it reaches nursing breasts. Sounds insane now, right? Back then, gospel truth. But here's where it gets worse. If milk was blood, and blood was your life force, then breastfeeding was literally draining a woman's vital energy. Galen taught that every drop of milk cost the mother precious blood, weakening her, aging her, sapping her strength. Think about how terrifying this would sound to medieval families. Your wife nurses the baby. She's bleeding internally. She's sacrificing her life force for this child. Royal physicians took this deadly seriously. They weren't being cruel. They thought they were saving queens' lives. The most dangerous part of Galenic theory, the fertility connection. Galen observed that nursing mothers often didn't menstruate. He concluded this meant lactation completely blocked conception. Not sometimes, not usually, always. Medieval physicians turned this into medical law. Breastfeeding women cannot get pregnant, period. Now here's the cruel irony. Galen was partly right. Exclusive breastfeeding does suppress ovulation through lactation or amenorrhea, but it's not absolute. It varies wildly between women. Galen's followers ignored these nuances. To them, nursing meant infertility, case closed. For royal women, this created an impossible trap. Your primary job isn't mothering, it's manufacturing heirs. Male heirs, preferably multiple ones, because half of all babies died before age 5. If Galenic theory said nursing prevented pregnancy, then nursing was treason against the crown. Every month you spent breastfeeding was a month you weren't conceiving the next prince. Court physicians did the math. One baby nursing for a year meant one less heir in the succession. Maternal bonding versus dynastic survival. Guess which one? The medical logic was brutally simple. Queen gives birth. Baby gets handed to wet nurse within hours. Queen's body recovers faster. Menstruation returns quickly. She can conceive again. Meanwhile, her milk dries up from disuse. No wasted blood, no depleted energy, no blocked fertility. Medieval physicians genuinely believed they were optimizing the royal reproductive system, like farmers breeding livestock for maximum output. That's not an exaggeration. Court medical texts literally compared queens to valuable breeding animals. Efficient, productive, always pregnant, or trying to be. Court physicians turned this into sacred doctrine. They'd examine wet nurse candidates like they were selecting prize cattle. Age, health, temperament, even the size and shape of their breasts. The milk itself got inspected. Colour, consistency, taste. Yeah, royal doctors literally tasted wet nurse milk to approve it for royal babies. Meanwhile, the actual mother, forbidden from nursing. Some queens begged, some wept. Didn't matter. Galenic theory trumped maternal instinct every single time. The king needed heirs. The queen's body belonged to the state. The pressure was relentless. Marie de Medici produced 6 children in 8 years, trying to secure the French succession. Catherine de Medici had 10 babies in 15 years. Their bodies were perpetual pregnancy machines, constantly cycling between birth, recovery, and conception. No time for bonding, no months of nursing, just endless reproduction until their fertility failed or they died trying. Some queens had 8, 9, 10 pregnancies. Many died in childbirth. The lucky ones just went insane from the constant physical and emotional trauma. The real tragedy: many royal mothers desperately wanted to nurse their babies. Letters survive showing their grief, their pleading with physicians, their heartbreak at watching another woman feed their child. But Galenic theory made maternal desires irrelevant. One French queen wrote about begging to breastfeed just once, to feel that connection with her newborn. The court physician refused, warning it would endanger the succession. She never held her baby again except for formal presentations. The child grew up calling the wet nurse mother. This system fed on itself. Each generation of royal women raised by wet nurses grew up thinking maternal separation was normal. They accepted the medical theories because they'd lived the consequences. When they became mothers, they submitted to the same brutal protocol. Hand over the baby, suppress the grief, get pregnant again. The emotional damage was generational, cold, formal relationships between royal parents and children. Kids who barely knew their biological mothers. Mothers who watched their babies from a distance, like visiting strangers. So there you have it. Ancient medical theory warped into royal policy. Galen's blood and milk mythology became the scientific justification for treating queens like breeding stock. And the worst part? Everyone involved thought they were doing the right thing, protecting royal health, maximizing heir production, following the best medical knowledge available. The road to hell, paved with good intentions and terrible science. As we'll see next, this created a cascade of suffering that reached far beyond palace walls, affecting wet nurses, their families, entire communities caught in this system. Choosing the royal wet nurse. Picture this, a job posting that could make or break your entire family's future. But first, you had to pass the most intimate, degrading interview process imaginable. Court physicians would examine every inch of your body, taste your breast milk, judge your moral character, rate your temperament like livestock. And here's the twisted part. Hundreds of women lined up for this opportunity, because feeding a royal baby meant status, money, security, even if it meant sacrificing your own child in the process. The selection committee was brutal. Royal physicians led the charge, armed with medical texts that read like shopping lists for human cattle. Court officials watched every examination, taking notes. But the real decision makers? The prospective wet nurses themselves, desperate women willing to compete against neighbours and friends. They knew the stakes: land grants, lifetime pensions, royal protection. Some travelled hundreds of miles just for the chance to audition. The competition was fierce because failure meant returning to poverty. Success meant everything. First came the health inspection. Strip completely. Stand still while strange men poked, prodded, examined every detail. They checked your teeth, your hair, your skin. Any sign of disease meant instant disqualification. They'd inspect your hands for calluses. Too much hard labour was bad. Too soft meant you were lazy. Your complexion mattered. Your posture, even your voice got evaluated. They believed everything about you would transfer to the royal baby through your milk. One pockmark, one crooked tooth, one nervous stutter could destroy your chances completely. Age requirements were specific and unforgiving. Too young meant your milk wasn't mature enough. Too old meant you were past your prime. The sweet spot, 25 to 35, with recent birthing experience. Your own baby had to be the right age, not too new, not too old. Temperament testing came next. Angry women produced bitter milk they believed. Sad women made sickly milk. You had to be calm, cheerful, modest, but not too cheerful. That suggested loose morals. The psychological evaluation was almost medieval in its superstition. Then came the breast examination. This is where it gets really invasive. Court physicians would squeeze, measure, assess the shape and size. They'd actually taste your milk, checking colour, consistency, sweetness. Different doctors had different theories about ideal breast size. Too small meant insufficient supply. Too large meant excessive, possibly unhealthy abundance. They'd examine your nipples for cracks or abnormalities. Some courts required daily milk samples during the evaluation period. The humiliation was part of the process, breaking down your dignity before building you up as royal property. Your own infant became a bargaining chip in this twisted selection game. Courts preferred wet nurses whose babies were the same sex as the royal child. Boys needed different milk than girls, supposedly. But here's what's heartbreaking. The moment you got the position, your own baby was immediately weaned or handed off to another wet nurse of lower status. The chain went down through social classes, with the poorest women nursing their own children while everyone else fed upward. Your maternal bond was severed for royal convenience. The excitement among candidates was palpable and desperate. Women would arrive weeks early, camping near the palace, networking with current staff, bribing guards for insider information about preferences. They'd study previous royal wet nurses, trying to copy their appearance and mannerisms. Some hired coaches to practice their posture and speech. Others brought character references from local clergy or nobility. The atmosphere was part job fair, part beauty pageant, part cattle auction. Everyone knew only one woman would win, making the others lifelong enemies. But success came with a horrible price that nobody talked about openly. Historical records show that wet nurses' own children often died after being abruptly weaned and handed to lesser caregivers. Malnutrition, neglect, simple heartbreak from losing their mothers. Court physicians kept meticulous records about royal infants but rarely mentioned what happened to the abandoned babies. It was collateral damage in the pursuit of royal succession. Some wet nurses never saw their biological children again, dedicating years to raising someone else's baby while their own became forgotten casualties. The irony was staggering when you really think about it. They called this process scientific, medical, necessary for royal health. But it was human trafficking, dressed up in fancy medical theories. Women competing to sell their bodies, their milk, their maternal instincts to the highest bidder. The selection process treated something as natural as nursing like a commercial transaction. Breast milk became a luxury commodity. Maternal bonds became contracts with termination dates. The most natural act in human biology got turned into artificial, regulated, commodified service. Having a royal wet nurse position was the ultimate status symbol for aspiring families. It meant your bloodline was good enough for royalty. Your milk was pure enough for future kings. Your character was virtuous enough for palace life. Communities would celebrate when local women got selected, throwing festivals, bragging about their connection to the crown. But underneath all the pageantry was exploitation, women forced to abandon their own babies, submit to humiliating examinations, and commodify the most intimate aspects of motherhood for economic survival. This whole system reveals something dark about how societies valued women's bodies over women's hearts. The selection process was elaborate, expensive, supposedly scientific, but it was really about controlling reproduction, separating mothers from babies, turning natural biological processes into transactions between social classes. Royal babies got the best available care, while wet nurses' own children suffered or died. The machinery of monarchy required this sacrifice, and women had no choice but to participate or watch their families starve. Sweet dreams if you can manage them after hearing this. Life in the royal nursery. Picture the most luxurious baby's room you can imagine. Now multiply that by 1,000. Royal nurseries weren't just rooms. They were entire establishments. Separate wings of palaces. Sometimes whole buildings dedicated to raising a single infant. But here's what gets me about these places. The most important person in that nursery? It wasn't the royal baby. It wasn't even the queen mother. It was the wet nurse. A commoner who held more power over the future king than his own mother. These nurseries were ridiculous. Silk wallpapers imported from China, crystal chandeliers hanging over hand-carved cradles, floors of polished marble that servants scrubbed daily on their knees, gold-leafed furniture sized for children who could barely sit up. Marie Antoinette's nursery at Versailles had miniature thrones, actual thrones, for toddlers. The French spent more on decorating that single room than most families saw in a lifetime. But all that wealth couldn't buy the one thing these babies really needed: their mothers. The wet nurse got her own apartments. Not a room, apartments. Multiple rooms with servants and a kitchen staff. She ate better food than most nobles, wore dresses that cost more than a year's wages for common folk, had her own carriage, her own allowance, gifts from grateful parents. The wet nurse to Louis XIV lived like royalty herself. Why? Because she was feeding the future Sun King. Her milk was literally liquid gold to the French court, more valuable than the Queen's blood apparently. Here's where it gets twisted. The biological mother had to ask permission to see her own child. Permission from a servant. The wet nurse controlled everything, feeding schedules, sleep times, who could visit when. She decided if the baby was too tired for Mama's visit, too fussy, and the Queen? She smiled and accepted it, because challenging the wet nurse meant risking the infant's health. At least that's what everyone told her. The woman feeding her baby held all the cards. The records from Versailles are heartbreaking. One entry describes Queen Maria Theresa waiting outside the nursery for 2 hours because her son was napping. Her own son. Another tells of a wet nurse refusing to let Queen Louise hold her daughter because the baby had just been fed and might spit up on the Queen's dress. Think about that. A servant telling a queen she can't hold her own child because of laundry concerns, and the Queen just accepted it. The schedules were military precise, feeding every 2 hours, baths at exactly 9 in the morning, afternoon walks when weather permitted. Bedtime stories at 7:30, not 7:29 or 7:31. The wet nurse ran this like a tiny kingdom, and everyone, including the actual Queen, had to follow her rules. These infants lived more regulated lives than monks. Every minute planned, every need anticipated, except for the need to be held by the woman who gave birth to them. I found this letter from 1682. A French queen writing to her sister, "I visited my son today for 10 minutes. The wet nurse says longer visits overstimulate him. I am allowed to kiss his forehead but not pick him up during feeding days. I feel like a stranger admiring a neighbour's child through a window. He reaches for her when he cries, not for me. I gave him life, but she gives him everything else." Imagine writing those words about your own baby. Some queens fought back. Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatine threw an absolute fit when told she couldn't breastfeed her son. She screamed at the court physicians, called them idiots and worse, but even she eventually surrendered. The pressure was too intense. The guilt trips about royal duty, about endangering the succession, about being selfish, they wore these women down. The system was designed to make them feel guilty for wanting to mother their own children, and it worked. The wet nurses became surrogate mothers in every way that mattered. They knew which lullabies soothed each prince, which foods each princess preferred. They were there for first words, first steps, first everything. Meanwhile, the biological mothers showed up like formal visitors, awkward and uncertain with children who barely knew them. Some royal kids called their wet nurses Mama and their actual mothers Your Majesty. That's not an exaggeration. It's documented in court records from across Europe. The saddest part, these royal mothers learned to accept it. They convinced themselves this was normal, even beneficial. "My son needs proper care," they'd say. "The wet nurse knows best." They built walls around their broken hearts and pretended separation was natural. Some genuinely started believing their children were better off without them. The system didn't just steal their babies, it stole their confidence, their instincts, their belief that they mattered as mothers. Complete psychological defeat. So that was life in the royal nursery. Opulent and cold, regulated and heartless. A place where servants held more power over royal children than their own mothers. Where wet nurses became the real parents, while queens became occasional visitors to their own offspring. A system so twisted, it convinced mothers that loving their babies was selfish, that wanting to feed and hold their children was somehow wrong. Sweet dreams, and hug your kids tight tonight. Medieval medical misconceptions. Picture this: royal physicians in elaborate robes, examining wet nurse candidates like they're inspecting livestock, checking their blood, tasting their milk, measuring their temperament, all based on medical theories that were half superstition, half genuine observation, twisted into something dangerous. These weren't ignorant village healers. These were the most educated men of their time, university trained, speaking Latin, consulting ancient texts. And they were spectacularly, tragically wrong about how women's bodies actually work. Tonight we dive into the pseudoscience that separated mothers from babies, the foundation of their beliefs. Galen's theory from ancient Rome: breast milk was transformed blood, flowing from a woman's heart to her breasts. Lactation drained her life force, weakened her constitution, made her body unsuitable for conception. This wasn't metaphor to them. They literally believed nursing prevented pregnancy completely. And here's the thing, they weren't entirely wrong. Breastfeeding can suppress ovulation through lactational amenorrhea, but medieval physicians turned this variable biological process into an absolute law. If you're nursing, you cannot conceive. Period. End of discussion. So royal mothers faced an impossible choice that wasn't actually a choice at all. Nurse your baby and fail your kingdom by preventing the next heir, or hand your newborn to a stranger and fulfill your royal duty. Court physicians made this decision easy by removing all options. Queens were told breastfeeding was medically dangerous, would weaken them, might kill them. Some genuinely believed this. Others knew it was manipulation, but had no power to resist. The pressure was relentless. Your body exists to produce heirs, not nurture them. The wet nurse selection process was elaborate theatre disguised as medical science. Physicians examined candidates like they were breeding horses. Age between 25 and 35, check. Good moral character, whatever that meant. Moderate temperament, proper breast size, recent childbirth. They'd inspect her milk's colour and consistency. Some court records mention physicians actually tasting the milk to ensure proper flavour. Imagine being a desperate woman, letting strange men examine your body and bodily fluids for a chance to feed someone else's baby, while yours got handed off to whoever was available. Here's where it gets really dark. The wet nurse's own baby became collateral damage. When she took the royal position, her infant was immediately weaned or given to another wet nurse, lower on the social ladder. This created a brutal hierarchy. The poorest women nursed their own babies, while every class above them fed the babies of their social superiors. Court records rarely mention what happened to the wet nurse's children. That silence tells you everything. Some died from abrupt weaning. Others survived but lost their mothers to serve the nobility. Meanwhile, royal infants lost benefits we now know are crucial. Mother's milk contains antibodies specific to the environment mother and baby share. Protection against diseases they're both exposed to. Wet nurses couldn't provide that targeted immunity. The nutritional composition changes as babies grow, perfectly calibrated to their developmental needs. Random wet nurses feeding multiple infants couldn't replicate that precision. And the bonding, the skin-to-skin contact, the hormonal exchanges during nursing that strengthen maternal attachment, all sacrificed to medieval medical theories about transformed blood and reproductive duty. The lactational amenorrhea thing is fascinating because medieval physicians observed something real, but misunderstood it completely. Exclusive breastfeeding can suppress ovulation through hormonal changes, but it's not universal, not permanent, not foolproof. Some women conceive while nursing, others remain infertile for years, whether they breastfeed or not. Medieval medicine turned this complex, variable biological process into a simple equation: nursing equals no babies, therefore queens must not nurse. The logic seemed airtight. The execution was devastating for families who had no choice but to comply with this royal reproduction math. What makes this especially tragic is that many royal mothers desperately wanted to nurse their babies. Marie Antoinette's letters describe her grief at being separated from her newborn daughter. She begged to breastfeed, but was forbidden by the king's physicians. Later, after producing a male heir, she defied convention and nursed one of her later children. Versailles was scandalized. Courtiers whispered she was behaving like a peasant, beneath royal dignity. Her choice to feed her own child became evidence she wasn't fit to be queen. Think about that for a second. The infant mortality rates in royal families tell a grim story. Despite access to the best medical care, nutrition, and living conditions available, royal babies died at alarming rates. Multiple factors contributed: primitive hygiene, lack of antibiotics, dangerous medical interventions. But immediate separation from mothers couldn't have helped. Babies denied their mother's milk, raised by wet nurses who might be feeding several infants, missing the bonding and antibodies that evolution designed to keep them alive. Some royal children never developed close relationships with their biological mothers. They grew up calling wet nurses mother and addressing their actual mothers with formal titles. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau started challenging these practices. They argued that mothers nursing their own children was natural, beneficial, part of returning to nature's wisdom. Wealthy women began seeing breastfeeding as fashionable and morally superior, a complete reversal from earlier attitudes. But royal families resisted change. Queen Victoria found breastfeeding distasteful, called it making a cow of oneself. She used wet nurses for all 9 children. Even her daughter, Crown Princess of Prussia, faced intense opposition when she wanted to breastfeed. German court physicians insisted it was medically dangerous and socially inappropriate. The practice didn't fully end until the mid-20th century. Queen Elizabeth II finally broke with tradition and nursed at least some of her children, though it was kept private. Princess Diana openly breastfed William and Harry in the 80s. By now, royal mothers like Catherine breastfeed without controversy. But for centuries, royal women's bodies were controlled by pseudoscience masquerading as medicine. Their maternal instincts suppressed, their choices denied, their babies taken away so they could serve as reproductive machines for the state. Sweet dreams, and be grateful your body belongs to you. Breaking the chains. A royal rebellion. Here's the thing about rebellion. Sometimes it looks like revolution. Sometimes it looks like a mother refusing to let strangers feed her baby. Marie Antoinette gets remembered for "let them eat cake," which she never actually said. But what she really did, way more shocking to 18th century France. After producing the required male heir, the future Louis XV, she looked at court tradition and said, "Nope, I'm nursing this one myself." The scandal was immediate and brutal. Picture Versailles in 1785, the most rigid, formal court in Europe. Every gesture choreographed, every tradition sacred. Queens don't breastfeed, that's peasant work, animal behaviour. But there's Marie Antoinette, sitting in her private chambers, nursing her daughter Sophie. Courtiers are whispering, the king's physicians are appalled. Foreign ambassadors are writing shocked reports back to their capitals. A queen acting like a common mother. The audacity was breathtaking, and she didn't care. The criticism was vicious. Pamphlets circulated calling her unnatural, claiming she was destroying royal dignity. Court ladies whispered that she was behaving like a farm wife, that nursing would ruin her figure, make her smell of milk during state dinners. The irony, these same critics had spent years attacking her for being too frivolous, too disconnected from motherhood. Now she's too connected? French society couldn't handle a queen who actually wanted to mother her children. But Marie Antoinette had powerful support, her own mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. In letters, Maria Theresa encouraged her daughter to ignore French court physicians. "Trust your maternal instincts," she wrote. Nature intended mothers to feed their young. This from a woman who'd birthed 16 children and understood the political costs of defying convention. She knew her daughter was risking her reputation, and she supported her anyway. Mother backing daughter against an entire establishment. The Queen's rebellion went beyond nursing. She insisted on bathing her children herself, dressing them, reading to them. normal mother activities that were revolutionary for royalty. She built a private dairy at her petite hamlet, where she could pretend to be a simple country mother. Critics mocked this as play acting, but for Marie Antoinette, it was deadly serious. She was reclaiming motherhood from the machinery of state, and it terrified the establishment. Fast forward 50 years, Prussia, 1840s. Crown Princess Vicky arrives from Britain, daughter of Queen Victoria, wife to the future German Emperor. She's 19, brilliant, opinionated, and absolutely determined to nurse her children. The Prussian court is having none of it. German physicians declare it medically dangerous. Court officials call it undignified. But Vicky has something Marie Antoinette lacked. She's not just rebelling, she's bringing modern medical knowledge to an ancient fight. Vicky's rebellion was methodical. She studied the latest British and French medical research on breastfeeding benefits. She corresponded with progressive physicians across Europe. When Prussian doctors insisted wet nurses were safer, she quoted mortality statistics proving otherwise. When they claimed nursing would damage her health, she presented evidence of the opposite. This wasn't emotion, this was science, and the Prussian establishment hated being outmaneuvered by a teenage British princess. The pressure on Vicky was intense. Her mother-in-law, the formidable Prussian queen, called her defiance English eccentricity. Court physicians threatened her with medical consequences. Her husband, caught between his wife and his family, wavered constantly, but Vicky held firm. When her first son was born, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, she nursed him herself. The Prussian court was scandalized. A crown princess, behaving like a common woman. The horror was real. What's fascinating is how these women justified their rebellion. Marie Antoinette appealed to nature and maternal instinct. Vicky used scientific evidence and medical progress. Both faced the same accusation: they were abandoning royal dignity for animal behavior. Both had the same response: caring for your own child isn't undignified, it's human. They were redefining what queenship meant, from ornamental breeding machine to actual mother. Revolutionary stuff. The cost was enormous. Marie Antoinette's maternal rebellion became part of the propaganda against her during the Revolution. Her enemies used her peasant behavior as evidence she wasn't fit to be queen. Vicky faced decades of criticism from Prussian society, her English ways blamed for supposedly weakening German royal traditions. Both women paid politically for choosing their children over convention, but they kept nursing anyway. These weren't perfect mothers or perfect queens. Marie Antoinette was politically naive and sometimes genuinely frivolous. Vicky could be arrogant and culturally insensitive. But in this one area, they were pioneers. They looked at centuries of tradition that separated mothers from babies and said no. They chose biological bond over political convenience, maternal instinct over royal protocol, and they changed history one feeding at a time. Lifelong impact of wet nursing. Here's what nobody talks about. The wet nurse thing didn't end when royal kids got weaned. It shaped everything. Their entire emotional landscape, how they saw family, love, trust, because when you spend your first years bonding with someone who isn't your biological mother, that becomes your normal. That wet nurse becomes mom, and the woman who gave birth to you, she's just this formal figure who visits sometimes, wearing fancy clothes, using your title instead of saying sweetheart. Louis XIII of France called his wet nurse Mamanga his entire life. Not just as a kid, as an adult king. He'd sneak away from Versailles to visit her cottage, bringing gifts, asking for advice. Meanwhile, his actual mother, Marie de Medici, got the formal bow and Your Majesty. Think about that psychology for a second. The woman who fed you, comforted your nightmares, sang you lullabies, that's who your heart recognizes as mother. Biology means nothing compared to who held you when you cried. Catherine the Great wrote in her memoirs about feeling like a stranger to her own son Paul. She'd been forced to hand him over immediately after birth. Empress Elizabeth took complete control. Catherine wasn't allowed to see Paul without permission, couldn't comfort him when he was sick, couldn't even choose his clothes. By the time she regained access, they were polite acquaintances. She described it as mourning a living child. That's the language she used. Mourning, like he'd died but was still walking around. This emotional distance became the signature of royal families. Ice-cold relationships that everyone just accepted as normal. Kids who bowed to their parents instead of hugging them. Who said papa and mama like they were reading from a script. Queen Victoria barely knew her own children as people. She'd pop into the nursery for scheduled visits, inspect their progress like reviewing troops, then leave them with their nurses and tutors. Love became this administrative thing, duty disguised as affection. The weird part, many royals kept their wet nurses on payroll for life. Not out of guilt, though maybe some of that, but because these women knew them better than anyone. Queen Anne Stuart of England set up pensions for all her children's wet nurses, gave them houses, land, generous allowances. Meanwhile, her relationship with her own kids was so formal that when they died, she wrote about it like reporting on the weather. Cold, factual, no real grief coming through. Some royal children never recovered from this early separation trauma. They'd seek that maternal bond everywhere except where it should have been. Mistresses who reminded them of their nurses. Friends who provided the warmth their families couldn't. Charles II of England famously preferred the company of his wet nurse's family to his own. He'd holiday with them, laugh with them, act like a normal person, instead of performing royalty constantly. The psychological damage went deep. Royal children grew up believing love was conditional, performance-based, something you earned through proper behaviour. They never learned secure attachment, never experienced unconditional maternal affection during those crucial first months and years. Instead, they got professional caregiving from women paid to nurture them, while their actual mothers remained distant figures focused on producing the next heir. That's not love. That's employment. Contracted affection with built-in expiration dates. By adulthood, many royals couldn't form healthy relationships at all. They'd either cling desperately to anyone who showed genuine warmth, or they'd stay emotionally unavailable, protecting themselves from the abandonment they'd learned to expect. Marriage became political theatre, parenting became delegation. The cycle repeated because they literally didn't know what normal family bonding looked like. How could they give their children something they'd never received? Some tried to break the pattern. Marie Antoinette shocked Versailles by insisting on breastfeeding one of her later children. She'd learned from watching her own painful relationship with her distant mother, but the court system fought her every step. Courtiers whispered she was acting beneath her station, like showing basic maternal instinct was somehow embarrassing. A queen loving her baby? Scandalous. Better to hand the kid off and focus on looking decorative. The saddest cases are the ones where royals spent their whole lives trying to reconstruct that missing bond. James I of England obsessively controlled his children's marriages and friendships, desperately trying to keep them close after years of forced separation. But it was too late. The foundation of trust and intimacy had never been built. They were strangers sharing titles and bloodlines, going through the motions of family while feeling completely disconnected. Imagine growing up knowing your biological mother only as Your Majesty, never hearing her call you sweetheart or darling, never running to her when you're scared or hurt. The woman who gave birth to you becomes this formal figure you see at state occasions, while the woman who actually raised you gets dismissed as the help. That's generational trauma disguised as tradition. The crown was supposed to elevate these families above normal human experience. Instead, it stole their humanity. The winds of change. By the 1750s, something was shifting. All those centuries of royal mothers watching their babies disappear into wet nurses' arms, that was about to be challenged. Not by the mothers themselves, they still had no power, but by philosophers. Men with books and theories and growing influence over educated society. They started asking uncomfortable questions. Why exactly were wealthy women forbidden from nursing their own children? What if the medical theories were wrong? What if this whole system was unnatural? Jean-Jacques Rousseau dropped a bombshell in 1762. His book Emile declared that mothers nursing their own babies wasn't just natural, it was morally superior. Revolutionary stuff. He wrote that when mothers abandoned breastfeeding to wet nurses, they were abandoning their most sacred duty, that children needed their own mother's milk, their own mother's touch. The French aristocracy, absolutely scandalized. Here's this philosopher telling them their entire childcare system was wrong. But educated women started listening. The timing was perfect for these ideas to spread. This was the Enlightenment, when everything traditional was being questioned. Natural philosophy was trendy. The idea that maybe, just maybe, nature knew better than centuries of court physicians. That started making sense to people. Wealthy women in London and Paris began quietly nursing their babies. Not royalty, not yet, but successful merchants' wives, lawyers' wives. Women with enough social standing to risk breaking convention without losing everything. The medical community was slowly shifting too. Those old Galenic theories about breast milk being transformed blood, about lactation preventing conception. New research was poking holes in all of it. British physicians started admitting that maybe the relationship between breastfeeding and fertility wasn't as absolute as they'd claimed. Maybe some women could nurse and still conceive. Maybe the health benefits for babies were worth considering. Small steps, but steps forward. The centuries-old certainty was cracking. But resistance was fierce, especially in royal circles. The old guard fought back hard. Court physicians doubled down, insisting that queens attempting to breastfeed were risking their health and the monarchy's future. How could a lactating woman attend state functions? How could she maintain royal dignity while leaking milk? The practical arguments masked deeper fears. If royal women started acting like mothers instead of breeding machines, what came next? Where would it end? Still, change was spreading through the upper classes. By the 1780s, fashionable women in England and France were proudly nursing their babies. It became a status symbol, proof of your enlightened thinking and natural virtue. Portrait painting started showing mothers with nursing babies, something that would have been shocking 50 years earlier. The wet nurse industry began to panic. Suddenly their most prestigious clients were choosing to feed their own children. Business was disappearing. Royal families held out the longest. Queen Victoria despised the idea of breastfeeding, calling it disgusting. Kaiser Wilhelm II, born in 1859, was fed by a wet nurse. So were most European princes and princesses born in the 19th century. The stakes felt too high. Royal succession was still precarious. Infant mortality still deadly. Court physicians convinced royal mothers that wet nurses were safer, more reliable. Why risk the dynasty on philosophical trends? Then came Queen Elizabeth II. Born in 1926, she was fed by a wet nurse like her mother and grandmother before her. But when she had her own children in the 1940s and 50s, she quietly broke tradition. No announcements, no fanfare. She simply nursed Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward herself. The British press kept it mostly private, but inside royal circles everyone knew the Queen was breastfeeding. The old ways were finally ending. Princess Diana took it public. When William was born in 1982, she openly discussed breastfeeding in interviews. No shame, no hiding. She nursed both William and Harry, talked about the experience, normalized it completely. The British public loved it. Here was a royal mother acting like a mother. Not some distant figure in a tiara, but a woman feeding her baby. The transformation was complete. Ancient taboos crumbled in a decade. Today, royal mothers breastfeed without controversy. Catherine, Princess of Wales, nursed all 3 of her children. Meghan Markle did the same. The idea that queens couldn't or shouldn't nurse their babies seems absurd now. But resistance still lingers in subtle ways. Royal mothers face intense scrutiny about their feeding choices, their post-baby bodies, their parenting decisions. The control is gentler now, but it's still there. Progress, but not complete freedom. Think about that journey, from Marie Antoinette being scandalized for wanting to nurse her baby, to Princess Diana casually discussing breastfeeding on television. 200 years of philosophical arguments, medical discoveries, and brave mothers who refused to accept that their bodies belonged to anyone but themselves. The winds of change blew slowly, but they blew steadily, and tonight mothers feed their babies however they choose. That freedom was hard won. That choice was paid for in centuries of separation and grief. Reflecting on a disturbing legacy. So here we are, 10 chapters deep into this story, and honestly, it's hard to know what to do with all of this. We've walked through centuries of royal births, watched newborns torn from their mother's arms, seen queens reduced to breeding machines, and the thing that gets me most, this wasn't some ancient barbarism. Queen Elizabeth II's mother couldn't breastfeed her own daughters. The 1920s. Think about that. Your grandmother's generation, and royal women still had no say over their own bodies. What we've uncovered isn't just individual tragedy. It's systematic, methodical. For centuries, entire institutions built around the idea that royal women were valuable for one thing, their wombs. The moment a queen gave birth, the clock started ticking. How quickly could she conceive again? Her newborn? Secondary concern. The medical establishment, the court, the king himself, all aligned to separate mothers from babies. Not occasionally, not in emergencies, every single time, as policy, as requirement. And let's talk about the class exploitation here, because while royal mothers suffered, working class women paid the ultimate price. Think about those wet nurses, forced to abandon their own newborns, often watching them die from malnutrition or neglect, so they could feed royal babies instead. The hierarchy was brutal. Rich women's milk for richer babies, poor women's babies left to fend for themselves. This wasn't charity work, this was survival economics. Your child or theirs. Usually theirs won. The historical record is mostly silent about those abandoned children. Court documents obsess over royal infant feeding schedules, wet nurse selection criteria, palace nursery arrangements. But the babies left behind when their mothers became royal wet nurses, barely mentioned. Statistics are hard to find because nobody was counting. These children didn't matter to the people writing history. They were collateral damage in the royal reproduction machine. Their deaths were just expected, acceptable losses. The medical justifications were half science, half control mechanism. Yes, breastfeeding can delay ovulation, but not always, not for everyone. Medieval physicians treated it like absolute law. Breastfeeding equals infertility, therefore queens must not breastfeed. They ignored evidence that contradicted this theory, ignored women who conceived while nursing. The science served the politics. Keep queens pregnant. Keep the succession secure. Everything else, including maternal bonds and infant health, was negotiable. Reading the private letters of royal mothers, that's where the real heartbreak lives. Marie Antoinette begging to nurse her daughter. Victoria's daughter Vicky fighting Prussian court doctors who forbade breastfeeding. These women had wealth, power, privilege beyond imagination, but they couldn't make the most basic choice about their own bodies and babies. The grief in their words, it's devastating. Imagine having everything except the right to feed your own child. That's the reality these women lived. And the children, growing up calling their wet nurses mother, and their actual mothers by formal titles. Louis XIII visited his wet nurse throughout his adult life, while maintaining distant ceremonial relationships with his birth parents. These emotional patterns shaped royal family dynamics for generations. The coldness, the formality, the inability to connect. When you're raised by hired strangers, while your biological parents remain distant figures of authority, attachment becomes complicated. Here's what really bothers me. The glamour narrative always glossed over this. Royal biographies focus on coronations, marriages, political intrigue. But the systematic separation of mothers and newborns, the exploitation of working class women, the babies who died so royal infants could be fed, that gets maybe a footnote. We romanticize royal motherhood while ignoring that royal mothers had less autonomy than peasant women, less choice about their own children than servants had about theirs. Change came slowly, painfully slowly. Queen Elizabeth II broke tradition and nursed some of her children in private, quietly, without fanfare. Princess Diana openly breastfed in the 1980s, helping normalise it for upper-class British women. Catherine, Princess of Wales, breastfeeds without controversy today. But think about the timeline. Hundreds of years of forced separation, generations of royal mothers denied this basic choice, and meaningful change only happened in our lifetimes. That's how deeply entrenched this control was. What does this tell us about women's autonomy throughout history? That even women with ultimate privilege, queens, empresses, the most powerful women of their eras, still had their bodies controlled by men, still had their choices dictated by politics, medicine, social expectations. If royal women couldn't make decisions about their own pregnancies, births, and babies, what hope did ordinary women have? The fight for bodily autonomy isn't new. It's been going on for centuries, and it's still going on today. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry this with you. Your body is your own. Your choices about pregnancy, birth, feeding your children, they belong to you, not to politicians, not to doctors who think they know better, not to institutions that see women as useful primarily for reproduction. The queens and empresses of history didn't have these freedoms. Countless working class mothers throughout history didn't have these freedoms. But you do. That's worth protecting. That's worth fighting for. Sleep well, knowing your autonomy is sacred.